The story that's about to be told is documented in Jacob's archived live streams. Well, was documented. He has since deleted most of them by now. But there are clips out there if you know where to look. Just don't look too hard. The deeper you dig, the more likely you are to find something. Watching back. It all started 3 months ago. During Jacob's regular evening gaming streams, Jacob was not a huge creator. Around 50,000 followers, enough to make a decent living, but still far from being a household name. His content was simple. He played horror games 4 nights a week, face cam in the corner, usual reaction stuff. The content was nothing groundbreaking, but his viewers seemed to enjoy his genuine terror at jump scares. It turns out he didn't know what real terror was until all this started. The first comment appeared on a VOD of his Resident Evil playthrough. "Who's that standing in your doorway at 1:03:03? At first, Jacob ignored it. It was normal to get these prank comments from fans when you stream horror games. But later that night, Lynn, Jacob's head mod, messaged him on Discord. "Hey Jacob, have you seen the comments from last night's VOD? Might want to check that timestamp." Lynn had been with Jacob since he had 10 viewers. She wasn't the type to buy into conspiracy theories. If something caught her attention, it was worth investigating. Jacob pulled up the archive. Nothing unusual had happened during that stream, just him screaming at brutes like an idiot for 3 hours. But when he checked that timestamp, his heart dropped to his feet. There was definitely something there. A dark shadow barely visible in the dark hallway behind him. He couldn't make out any features, but the shadow was certainly human-shaped, and it seemed to be watching. The weird thing was, he had had his LED strips on that night. He always did. That part of the hallway should have been bathed in purple light. Jacob immediately called Lynn and his other mod, Marcus. "Tell me you guys see it too," he said, sharing his screen. "Yes," Marcus replied after a long pause. Crystal clear. "But I don't understand. I was watching the entire live last night. There was definitely nothing in the hallway. Otherwise, I would have seen it." Lynn was already going through the live chat logs. "Nothing here either. Not a single person mentioned seeing anything during the broadcast. It's only in the replay." "Could it be a compression artifact?" Marcus suggested. "Or maybe someone hacked the upload." Jacob checked the original recording on his local drive. The shadow was there too. Same timestamp, same position, same human-like form. "Run it through DaVinci," Lynn suggested, calm and methodical. "Let's enhance the brightness, see what we're dealing with." Jacob did, and wished he hadn't. With the brightness and contrast adjusted, the figure became more distinct. Not clearer exactly, but more wrong. Like looking at a human shape that had been slightly distorted, stretched in ways that shouldn't be possible. For the next week, Jacob obsessively reviewed his old streams. The more he looked, the more he found. And to his horror, the figure had been appearing for weeks before anyone had started to notice. It was always behind him, always getting closer, always just slightly more visible in each stream. And always only in the replays. It's following a pattern, Lynn pointed out during one of their late-night Discord calls. She'd compiled a spreadsheet of appearances, timestamps, positions, stream titles. Look at the timestamps, 1:13:13, 1:23:23, 1:33:33. Out of all of them, she seemed to be the only one still able to maintain that same practical, unaffected demeanor. "Could be a bug in the streaming software," Marcus said, but he didn't sound convinced. "What if we—" He cut off suddenly. "What?" Jacob asked, nerves starting to fray. "We'll have to check the next logical timestamp in that sequence. 1:43:43. Jacob's blood ran cold. The next stream was scheduled for the day after tomorrow. He almost canceled it completely. Even silently planned he won't play until they reached 1:43:43. But by then, clips from the previous streams were starting to circulate. People thought it was an elaborate marketing campaign. His viewer count rocketed. Sponsors were reaching out. And part of him hoped, that Marcus was right about it being a software glitch. Maybe they won't find anything after all, and this would help to prove their timestamp theory wrong. He tried not to consider the alternative. To prepare, he changed his setup. Bought more lights, rearranged his room so there was nowhere to hide, installed a second camera facing behind him. When he posted an update for the scheduled live stream, the comments were flooded with people excitedly waiting to spot the figure. But during live broadcasts, there was never anything to see. That day, the stream started like any other. He was playing an indie horror game, trying to act normal while obsessively checking his live feed. His hands were shaking so badly that he kept missing simple turns in the game. The chat noticed, of course, but they thought he was just immersed in the game's atmosphere. If only they knew. When the timestamp approached, the temperature in Jacob's room dropped suddenly. Impossible for a room with central heating in summer. The stream stuttered for a fraction of a second. Just a tiny hiccup. But in that moment, every hair on his body stood on end. Something felt wrong on a primal level, like a mouse sensing a snake's presence. But none of this had appeared on the live monitor. Even Jacob could see nothing reflected in the camera facing behind him. He played the game on autopilot, no longer able to concentrate, and the chat, who knew nothing about the timestamp, teased him for being scared of such a normal scene in the game. And then, as abruptly as it had started, the cold dissipated as if nothing had ever happened. But something definitely did, and the VOD replay revealed exactly what. The figure was there, standing directly behind Jacob's chair, and this time, he could make out details he wished he'd never seen. Its proportions were wrong, arms too long, neck bent at an impossible angle. But it was the suggestion of its face that horrified him. It was as if someone had taken human features and rearranged them by throwing dice. Eyes where they shouldn't be, a mouth that wrapped too far around what might have been a head, and all of it seemed to be looking directly at the camera, directly at anyone watching the playback. Jacob couldn't sleep that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that almost face. Lynn and Marcus stayed on Discord with him until dawn, analyzing the footage frame by frame. That's when they noticed something worse. In each frame, the figure's position changed slightly, not like normal movement, more like stop-motion animation, jerky and unnatural. In one frame, its hand reached toward his head. In the next, it withdrew, reaching, withdrawing, like it was practicing. Clips from the replay went viral, of course. Jacob's DMs exploded with questions about how he'd done it, what software he'd used, whether it was all planned. All the big streamers were breaking down the footage, trying to spot the edits. That brought it even more viewers. Sponsors were throwing money at him for what they thought was marketing genius. But then the messages started getting darker. People reported seeing movement in their own recordings after watching Jacob's clip. Small things at first, shadows where there shouldn't be shadows, slight distortions in their face cam backgrounds. One viewer sent him a clip of their own stream, and he made the mistake of watching it at 2 a.m. There, in their bedroom window, was something with too many eyes and that same wrong smile. He tried to warn people, but that only made his channel grow faster. Hundreds of thousands of viewers now, all waiting for the next appearance, all sharing clips, all spreading whatever this thing was. All this fame, it was everything he had ever dreamt of, but he felt none of the excitement, only fear. The final stream wasn't planned. Jacob had actually decided to quit, had a whole announcement ready. But when he woke up that morning, his streaming software was already running. His monitors were on, displaying his empty chair. He should have just pulled the plugs, should have smashed the computers, should have burned the whole setup right then and there. Instead, like an idiot in a horror movie, he sat down to investigate. The viewer count was climbing even though he hadn't announced a stream. The chat was moving too fast to read, but one word kept repeating, behind. The stream feed froze for exactly 3 seconds. Jacob remembered checking the timer. 3 seconds where his heart nearly burst from his chest. 3 seconds of complete silence. Not even the hum of his PC fans. The Discord call erupted. End the stream. Jacob, get out of there! Don't look at the monitors! He tried to end the stream immediately, but his PC wouldn't respond. The mouse moved on its own, opening video files he'd never seen before. Each one showed the figure, standing in the backgrounds of his life, at the grocery store, in his car's rearview mirror, beside his bed while he slept. All captured by cameras he didn't have, at timestamps that matched the pattern. When he finally managed to turn everything off, having to go so far as to pull the circuit breaker, his phone lit up with voice messages from Lynn and Marcus. Their own cameras had activated during his stream. Their own recordings showed shadows learning to move. When he checked the VOD later, for God knows why, those 3 seconds showed something that still made him wake up screaming. Every monitor in his setup displayed the same image. The figure, no longer content to stay in the background. It was pressed right up against his chair, its 2 long arms wrapped around the backrest. The face, that face with its distorted features, was inches from his neck. Smiling, always smiling, but not the way a human smiles. Like something that learned about smiles from studying videos in reverse. The worst part? In the VOD, you could see his reflection in the main monitor. He was just sitting there staring ahead, completely unaware of what was behind him, completely unaware of how close those hands were, completely unaware that in the final frame, one of those hands was touching his shoulder. After that, he didn't just delete his channel, he destroyed everything, smashed every screen in his apartment, but it wasn't enough. The next day, his kitchen microwave's digital display showed a playback countdown. His car's backup camera caught something smiling from the back seat. Even his damn smart doorbell kept capturing 3-second videos of his empty hallway. Except they weren't empty in playback. Wherever he went, where there were screens, the screen would flicker. And in those flickers, he swore he could see a reflection that wasn't his. Something with too many angles. Something getting closer. Lynn and Marcus hadn't streamed since either. Lynn said she once caught something moving in her webcam's preview window. Marcus didn't come online at all the days after that incident. Some people claimed they could see the figure reaching for Jacob in that last frame. Others swore they'd spotted it in their own streams now. A few said they'd found it in their personal videos, home security footage. Always in the playback, never in real time. Jacob didn't stream anymore. He didn't play games, not even normal games. He'd covered or gotten rid of every screen in his apartment. But sometimes, just as he was falling asleep, he swore he could feel something standing behind him, watching. And every morning, his phone's gallery would have new videos he didn't remember recording. He never played them. He didn't think he will. But sometimes, late at night, he did wonder. If he did play those videos, would he see it? Would it still be smiling? And most importantly, would it still be moving closer? One night, he got one final message from Marcus. Whatever you do, don't check timestamps 3:33:33. Don't let anyone else check either. I found something in the code. It's not just watching anymore. It's learned. His Discord account was deleted immediately after. If you're a streamer, do yourself a favor. Don't look too closely at your archive footage. Some things are only meant to be seen in playback, and once you notice them, they notice you too. And if you think you see something strange in your VODs, for God's sake, don't check the timestamps. Some numbers have a way of repeating. Some patterns want to be found. Trust me on this one. Just keep streaming. Keep your eyes forward. And whatever you do, don't look behind you when you're watching your replays, because it isn't there. Not in real time anyway. A note was found on Marcus's desk after his disappearance, written in shaky handwriting. It's not a glitch. It's not a hack. It's using our streams to watch us, to learn from us, to spread. Every playback makes it stronger. Every viewer gives it another window. If you're reading this, remember, don't watch your replays. Don't ever watch them. It's already too late. Working the night shift as a rideshare driver in Chicago meant you saw some strange things. Drunk college students, sketchy characters, people having the best or worst nights of their lives. But nothing prepared Jack for last Tuesday night. He'd been trying to make sense of what happened, checking his ride logs over and over. The addresses were there, the timestamps matched, but the rest, he needed to write it down before he convinced himself it was all in his head. The first pickup that night was at 11:42 p.m. Regular fare, nothing unusual about the request. The pin dropped at the corner of Damen and Milwaukee, outside that old dive bar with the neon sign that never quite worked right. The passenger rating was good, 4.8 stars, Account created 2021. Sarah M. He pulled up to the curb, and there she was, mid-20s, brown hair cut in a neat bob, wearing a green wool peacoat. Nothing remarkable except for how unremarkable she looked. Like a stock photo of a young professional come to life. "Thanks for stopping," she said, sliding into the back seat. Her voice was soft, slightly hoarse, like she'd been at a loud venue. "I need to go to 1879 West Palmer." He punched in the address. It was in an industrial area, mostly abandoned warehouses. Not the best neighborhood, but who was he to judge? "Long night?" he asked, pulling away from the curb. Making conversation was part of maintaining a good rating. "Yeah," she replied, then fell silent, staring out the window. The drive was quiet after that, just the hum of tires on asphalt and the occasional ping from his phone. When they reached the address, she got out with a quiet "thank you" and walked toward one of the warehouses. He waited until she reached the door. Company policy and basic human decency, you know? She disappeared inside and he marked the ride complete. 3 stars. She was polite but weird, pretty standard for late nights. The next fare came in at 12:17 a.m. Different part of town, up by Wicker Park. As he pulled up to the pickup point, his stomach dropped. Standing under the streetlight was a woman in a green peacoat, brown bob, same height as Sarah M. What on earth was going on? Was it one of those costume parties where everyone dressed up as some sort of character? If this was a coincidence, it was a mad crazy one. Different address, though in the same area, and a different account. She got in the car. He was pretty sure she had the same face as Sarah M. But it was slightly off, like a photo that's been taken in poor lighting. Her skin seemed paler under the streetlights, her eyes darker in the shadows. 1879 West Palmer, please. Same soft, hoarse voice. There was no way it was a different woman now. He turned around to get a better look. "Didn't I just drop you off there?" She tilted her head, confused. "No, this is my first ride tonight." "But you're..." He stopped. What was he going to say? "You're the same person, but something's not quite right?" He has to calm down. Maybe she had a personal reason for doing this. And it wasn't his job to pry. His job was to get passengers to wherever they wanted to go. And if they wanted to go back and forth 5 times in a night, who cares as long as he was getting paid? "Never mind. Must be thinking of someone else." The drive was silent again, but this time the silence felt heavy. In his rearview mirror, he could see her staring straight ahead, unblinking. When they passed under streetlights, her reflection in the window seemed to lag just a fraction of a second behind her movements. Same destination, same quiet "thank you," same walk to the warehouse door, but this time, he could have sworn the door never opened. She just reached it and was gone. His hands were shaking as he marked the ride complete. 2 stars. Something was very wrong. 12:52 a.m. Another ping, a different neighborhood a little further out, but his heart was racing. "Please, please, please," he begged inside his head. "Please let it be a man, or an old lady, or anyone, anything except that green peacoat." But of course, even before he turned the last corner, before reaching the pin, something told him he knew what he'd find. And there she was, green peacoat, brown bob, Rachel T., 4.8 stars, account created 2021. 2021 again. The moment she stepped into his car, the air seemed to grow impossibly thicker, harder to breathe. She moved with an unsettling grace that made his skin crawl. Not obviously wrong, but like someone who had studied human movement, but hadn't quite mastered it. Her face was familiar now, burned into his memory, but in the shifting light of passing cars, something about her features seemed to slide ever so slightly, like a painting viewed through rippling water. The peacoat was identical down to the slightly loose 3rd button, but the fabric didn't move quite right when she settled into the seat. It stayed too still, too rigid, as if it were painted onto her frame. 1879 West Palmer. The voice was still soft and hoarse, but now it had a subtle echo, as if she were speaking in a tiled room. Each consonant seemed to hang in the air a moment too long. He merged into traffic, his palms sweating on the steering wheel. The usual sounds of the city seemed muffled, distant. In the rearview mirror, he caught glimpses of her between streetlights. She was smiling, but the expression never reached her eyes. Those remained fixed, unblinking, reflecting the passing lights like polished glass. The car's temperature display showed 72 degrees, but his breath was coming out in faint puffs. The radio, which had been playing quietly, began to emit a low static that rose and fell like breathing. "Why do you keep getting in my car?" he finally asked, his voice cracking slightly. Her smile widened, just a fraction too far for comfort, but she continued to look straight out the window. "This is my first ride tonight." "No, it's not," he insisted, gripping the wheel tighter. "This is the third time. Same coat, same address. What's going on? What's in that warehouse?" She didn't answer immediately. In the mirror, he saw her tilt her head at an angle that seemed just slightly beyond natural. Her smile remained fixed, but her eyes, for just a moment, they seemed to catch the light wrong, like a cat's eyes in darkness. "You should be careful," she said finally, her voice now layered with what sounded like the same words spoken a fraction of a second apart. "Some questions don't have answers you want to hear." The rest of the ride passed in suffocating silence. Every time he checked the mirror, she was in a slightly different position, though he never saw her move. The static from the radio grew louder whenever they stopped at traffic lights, forming patterns that almost sounded like words. It took everything in him not to go insane. At the warehouse, she stepped out with movements that were too smooth, too precise. He watched as she walked to the door, her heels making no sound on the concrete. This time he was certain. She didn't open the door. She simply ceased to be there between one blink and the next. 1 star. Jack sat in his car for several long minutes, engine idling, staring at the warehouse. The logical part of his brain was screaming at him to go home, to log off, to forget this ever happened. 3 identical passengers, all going to the same address? The strange movements, the echoing voice, the impossible disappearances. Every instinct honed through years of late-night driving was telling him to get out of there. But there was another part of him, the part that had always gotten him into trouble, that needed to know more. What was happening? Were these women connected to the missing persons cases he'd been seeing on the news? Was he witnessing something supernatural, or was there a more mundane explanation? A cult gathering of sorts? The questions burned in his mind, demanding answers. He thought about calling the police, but what would he say? That he'd given the same woman 3 rides to a warehouse, but each time she was slightly different, more unsettling? That would sound crazy. And maybe it was crazy. He also had absolutely no proof. Each account was under a different name. Maybe he was tired, his mind playing tricks on him after too many late nights and too much caffeine. His finger hovered over the go offline button. 1 tap and he could end this, go home, try to forget. Instead, he found himself checking the time. The rides had come in exactly 35 minutes apart, if the pattern held. His phone pinged. 1:27 a.m., Madison Street, Lisa P., 2:03 a.m., North Avenue. Jennifer B., 2:38 a.m., Division Street, Catherine M. Each time, the same woman, but subtly wrong in ways that made his skin crawl. Each time, the same address. Each time, the same claim that it was her first ride. The wrongness was getting worse, but in ways he couldn't quite put into words. Lisa's movements were too precise, mechanical. Jennifer's voice had layers of echoes that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Catherine's eyes seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and when she spoke, her words seemed to bypass his ears and appear directly in his mind. All 4.8 stars, all accounts created 2021. By the time the 3:13 a.m. request came in, he was nearly hysterical, but he accepted it anyway. He had to see how this ended. The woman standing at the pickup point barely maintained the pretense of normality. The pea coat hung wrong, like it was suspended in water. Her hair moved independently of the wind. Her face, Christ, her face. It was like looking at all the previous versions at once, reality stuttering between them like a glitching video. Mary S., 4.8 stars. Account created 2021. She folded herself into the car with movements that seemed to skip frames. He couldn't look directly at her in the mirror anymore. His eyes simply slid away, refusing to process what they were seeing. In his peripheral vision, she was a suggestion of a shape wearing the memory of a green coat. 1879 West Palmer. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, a chorus of all the previous versions speaking in broken harmony. But by then he hardly reacted to it, was already expecting it. His GPS glitched, the screen filling with copies of the same address, overlapping and repeating. Then the car seemed to drive itself. He couldn't feel his feet on the pedals anymore. As they pulled up to the warehouse, he finally broke. "What are you?" She leaned forward. Her breath on his neck was like static electricity. "Check your ride history." He pulled out his phone with trembling hands. The night's rides were all there, but something was wrong with the timestamps. They weren't in chronological order anymore. They all showed the same time. 11:13. The next pickup should be due in about 10 minutes. "You're not going to make me do this again," he said. But when he looked in the mirror, the back seat was empty. The door hadn't opened. He checked the warehouse. The building was gone. Not abandoned or demolished, but simply gone like it had never existed. In its place was an empty lot with a single sign, "Coming soon, Echo and Palmer Luxury Apartments, breaking ground. 2021. His phone pinged. New ride request, Patricia R., 4.8 stars. Account created 2021. He deleted the app, sold his car the next day, started working days at his cousin's grocery store. He did, however, spend the next few days researching. The rideshare company's records showed he never drove anyone to 1879 West Palmer. They said that the address didn't even exist in their system. But they did find something strange. Last Tuesday night, 8 different women reported that their accounts had been used to request rides they never took. All 8 accounts had been created on the same day in 2021, November 13th. It didn't take long for Jack to find a particular news story from November 13th, 2021. It reported a structural collapse at a construction site during the initial demolition that had killed 8 women who'd been working late at Palmer Design Studios next door. The building had been evacuated, but they'd gone back in for project files needed for a morning deadline. The article included a photo from their company website, the design team standing together at a company event, all wearing matching green pea coats, a gift from their creative director. The article mentioned their plans had been scattered across the rubble. Architectural drawings for luxury apartments. The development was supposed to break ground the following month. One picture in the news report showed an empty lot with a sign saying, "Coming soon, Echo and Palmer, luxury apartments breaking ground. 2021. Sometimes late at night, his phone still pings even though he hasn't installed any rideshare apps. And when he checks it, there's always a new notification. Your ride is waiting. 4.8 stars. Account created 2021. He doesn't look out his window anymore after midnight. He's afraid he'll see a woman in a green pea coat standing under the streetlight, waiting. And he's even more afraid that this time, her face might be his. He still wonders if they ever found those project files in the rubble, or if maybe, just maybe, those 8 women are still trying to deliver them, night after night, to an address that no longer exists. Liam's footsteps echoed through the nearly empty subway station. Midnight had come and gone. The fluorescent lights flickered with an unsettling rhythm, casting long shadows across the tiled walls. He checked his watch. 2:17 a.m. The last train would arrive in minutes. A chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the station's perpetual dampness. Something felt wrong. The air seemed thicker, more oppressive than usual, pressing against his skin like a cold, damp cloth. At the far end of the platform, a figure stood motionless. Liam squinted. Most late-night passengers were hunched, weary, seeking anonymity. This figure stood unnaturally straight, facing away from him. No movement. no breathing, just stillness. The electronic board flickered. Next train, 3 minutes. Liam shifted his weight, the sound of his shoes scraping against the floor unnaturally loud in the cavernous space. The figure didn't react. Not a twitch, not a turn. He remembered the stories his grandfather used to tell, urban legends about the old subway lines, about passengers who disappeared between stations. Liam had always dismissed them as nonsense, typical tall tales told to frighten children. But now something about the figure, seemingly so out of place in a way he couldn't quite explain, made his heart race. Slowly, impossibly slowly, the figure began to turn. Its face was wrong, not fundamentally incorrect, but somewhat off in a primal way that his eyes could not discern. Was it the too pale skin that reflected the light wrong, or eyes that seemed too unnaturally dark, like an endless pit? Liam wanted to look away. He couldn't. The figure smiled, not a warm human smile, a tear in reality that suggested something resembling a smile. The overhead speakers crackled, a burst of static, then a whisper so soft he thought he might have imagined it. The train's rumble approached. Wind began to whip through the station, carrying the scent of stale tunnels and something else, something metallic, something old. Liam's legs felt frozen. The figure took a step forward, then another, moving with a jerking, unnatural gait that suggested movement without actual locomotion. "The train," Liam tried to say. No sound came out. Another step. Closer now. Close enough that Liam could see details he wished he couldn't. The figure's skin wasn't just pale, it was borderline translucent, like old paper. Veins and something darker moved beneath. The train rushed into the station, a metal beast emerging from darkness. Liam's survival instinct finally kicked in. He stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet. The figure was mere feet away now. The train doors opened with a hydraulic hiss. No passengers inside. Complete darkness. The figure raised one hand to its face, a long, too thin finger at its lips, as if to say they shared a deep, dark secret. Liam screamed, or tried to. Nothing came out. The train's interior lights flickered. He didn't dare board the train. He was trapped. The figure was inches from him now. Its hand reached out to touch Liam's shoulder. And then, Liam jerked away, a primal scream finally breaking free from his throat. The train's doors began to close, but the lights were on now, and Liam decided he would brave whatever is in there, then stay out there on the platform. He lunged forward, stumbling through the doorway, falling onto the train's floor. Behind him, the platform remained empty. No figure, no trace of what he'd seen. The train door hissed close and lurched forward. Liam's hands shook as he pulled himself up, pressing his back against the train's interior. The compartment was empty, completely empty. No other passengers, but it was no longer the hopeless emptiness he felt while on the platform. Just normal, sterile emptiness of a day's last train. Just the harsh fluorescent lights and the rhythmic rumble of wheels against tracks. When the train finally stopped at the next station, Liam ran. He didn't care who saw him, didn't care about looking foolish. He was glad there were people around at all to witness his foolishness. He ran until he was above ground, until cool, fresh air touched his skin, and the streetlights and car headlights grounded him that he was in the real world, until the cold, impossible memories of the subway platform began to feel like a nightmare. Still, he knew what he'd seen was real, and somewhere, deep in the city's underground arteries, something knew he had escaped. The next morning, transit workers would find nothing unusual, no sign of disturbance. Just another typical night on the subway system. Just another story Liam would never be able to fully explain. The surveillance room hummed with its usual late-night quiet. Peter adjusted his posture in the worn leather chair, eyes scanning the array of monitors displaying the airport's subway system's platforms and hallways. 12 screens, each a window into a different terminal, platform, and corridor. Camera 3 caught his attention first, a maintenance corridor. Something moved at the edge of the frame, too quick to identify. Peter rewound the footage. Nothing, just shadows and concrete. but he could have sworn he'd seen something thin and elongated, like a limb moving just beyond the camera's full view. He shifted focus to camera 7, the Terminal 2 platform. A woman in a red coat stood waiting, her back to the camera. Peter blinked. Her reflection in the station's tile wall didn't quite match her position, slightly offset, as if two images of her existed simultaneously. A logbook sat open beside him. For weeks he'd been documenting these anomalies, small inconsistencies that made no sense. 11:43 p.m., camera 5, passenger's shadow doesn't align with body. 12:17 a.m., camera 9, figure appears in two subway car windows at once. 1:05 a.m. Camera 12, reflection shows different clothing than passenger wearing, each entry carefully noted, each observation meticulously documented. On camera 11, a maintenance worker walked down a tunnel. Peter watched his movements. Something was off. The worker's legs seemed to move differently on the left side of the frame compared to the right. Not a glitch. Something else. He zoomed in. The worker's shadow split, subtly, impossibly. A crackle from his radio, just for a moment. A sound like distant conversation, multiple voices overlapping. Peter spun toward the sound. Nothing. When he turned back, the maintenance worker was gone from the screen. Peter barely had time to breathe when another screen flickered. Camera 6, the emergency stairwell. A figure stood halfway up the stairs. Two figures, overlapping, one solid, one translucent. Peter's hand moved to the radio and stopped. The figure or figures had already disappeared from view. How exactly was he going to report this? But he was sure something was moving through the subway system. Not just moving, existing, in the spaces between moments, between perception, and it was getting closer. The next screen caught his attention. Camera 2, a service passage rarely used after midnight. Peter leaned closer. A maintenance cart sat in the center of the frame, its position unchanged for the past hour. But something was different. The cart's shadow seemed to pulse, subtle movements, almost imperceptible, as if something was breathing beneath it, pushing against the concrete floor. He switched to the audio feed. Static crackled, then a whisper, multiple voices, overlapping, indistinct. Peter strained to listen. The voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. His logbook was filling up. Impossible observations. On camera 12, the Terminal 3 platform was empty. A figure stood at the far end, facing away. Multiple figures, overlapping, identical but not quite, like images seen through fractured glass. Peter's hands began to shake. He rubbed his eyes, thinking fatigue must be getting to him. He reached for his coffee. It had gone cold hours ago. The surface of the liquid rippled. No draft, no movement. Just a subtle vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Camera 5 went black, then camera 9, camera 2. One by one, the screens died, but not completely. Something moved in the darkness. Something was coming. The last screen flickered. Camera 7, the Terminal 2 platform. The image fragmented, then reformed. A figure stood impossibly close to the camera. Multiple figures, blending, merging. Peter's hand reached for the radio again. It vibrated. The static became a whisper. Voices. "They're here," someone said. Everyone said. And Peter dropped the radio as if it were scalding hot metal. The surveillance room temperature plummeted, and all the screens went black. Not black, something else. A depth that wasn't darkness. Peter let out a sound like a whimper, shaking uncontrollably now from head to toe. A sound came from the door behind him. He didn't turn, couldn't turn, because just then, the monitors erupted with movement. Figures, shadows, impossible geometries that folded into themselves. Peter felt his sanity slipping, become lightheaded with fear, then silence. Peter fainted. When the day shift arrived at 6 a.m., the surveillance room was perfectly normal. Monitors displayed their usual feeds. Coffee sat cold in a mug, but Peter was nowhere to be found. A logbook lay open, most pages blank. Only the last page showed anything. A single line written in a hand that was likely Peter's. "They're here." Emma had always considered herself observant. As a journalist, her career demanded attention to detail, the ability to notice what others missed. But nothing had ever unsettled her until she met the man on the C train. It began on a Tuesday in late October. The subway car was half empty, the harsh fluorescent lights casting a sickly glow on the tired commuters. Emma was reviewing her notes for an upcoming article, her laptop balanced precariously on her knees. That's when she first saw him. Middle-aged, perhaps early 50s, wearing a gray suit that had seen better days. The fabric was slightly shiny at the elbows, the white shirt beneath slightly yellowed at the collar. He sat 3 rows down, perfectly still, staring straight ahead with an expression of absolute neutrality. Nothing remarkable, Emma thought, except for how unremarkable he seemed, and a single red carnation tucked in his suit pocket. The next night, same train, same time. Emma found herself scanning the car, her eyes drawn to his seat before she could stop herself. There he was, identical, same suit, same position, same blank stare, the red carnation. A coincidence, she told herself. Rush hour, people take the same routes. But something nagged at her, especially that bright red flower. By the third night, Emma was actively watching. She positioned herself strategically, pretending to be absorbed in her laptop while stealing glances. The man hadn't moved the entire ride. Not a twitch, not a blink. His hands rested on his lap, perfectly still, as if they'd been positioned by someone else. She began to document her observations, searching for discrepancies. There were none. It was as if he never moved at all, never left the train. Her friends thought she was becoming obsessed. "It's just some guy on the train," her best friend Donna had said over drinks one night. "You're reading too much into nothing. Even you're on the same train every day." But Emma knew something was off. She'd seen familiar faces on the train before. There used to be an old lady who always came in with a black Labrador in tow, and she would often be in the same compartment as Emma, but she was also sometimes in another. With her, it was natural, but with this man, it was not. On the 5th night, as if some higher power wanted to play with her, something changed. As the train lurched out from the stop, the man suddenly turned, slowly, mechanically. His eyes locked directly with hers. They were completely blank, no emotion, no recognition, just a flat, empty stare that seemed to look through her rather than at her. And when she looked down at the flower at his chest, a chill ran down her spine. The bright red carnation today was not the fresh, bright red it always was. Today it was old and withered, and for reasons she couldn't grasp, the image of that decaying flower scared Emma beyond anything. She stood up, suddenly desperate to move, to break the connection. The train was still moving, and people threw her looks as she pushed her way down the compartment. But she needed to get away, and all the while she could feel his eyes on her back. She didn't look back. The next day, she began investigating, submitted requests to view city transit records. She scanned the employee database, just in case it was someone she was supposed to know. She found nothing. Her editor thought she was developing a story. "Interesting angle," he'd said. "The anonymity of city transit, the strangers we pass every day without knowing." But this wasn't about anonymity. This was about something else, something she couldn't explain. She started asking around, the train conductors, the transit police, the late-night staff. Nobody remembered seeing him. Nobody could confirm his existence. How could it be that she was the only one who noticed the same man on the train every day? Days turned into weeks, but the man never turned to look at her again. The man remained, always the same, always there, except for the flower. Now they were always withered and gray, a stark reminder that that day had not happened all in her head. Emma's sleep became fractured. Her work suffered. She found herself obsessively riding the C train, sometimes multiple times a day, searching for some explanation. And then, one night, he was gone. The seat was empty. No trace, no explanation. But she had her notes, her memories. Something had happened. Something she couldn't explain, and something else would soon happen. She could feel it, but all she could do was wait. The cruise ship Horizon glided through the thick Atlantic fog, its gleaming white hull cutting a pristine line through the pewter gray waters. Passengers aboard the luxury liner celebrated the start of a week-long Caribbean cruise, blissfully unaware that something was about to go terribly wrong. Elena had booked this trip as a much-needed escape from her high-stress job in New York. The cruise promised relaxation, sunshine, and a complete disconnect from her usual world of deadlines and presentations. The first 2 days passed seemingly normally, but subtle oddities began to accumulate like sediment in her memory. During the first evening's welcome dinner, a waiter accidentally dropped a tray, but the sound of shattering china seemed to be swallowed by an unnatural silence that descended on the dining room, lasting only a moment before conversations resumed as if nothing had happened. Then there were other things, a sudden chill in the otherwise climate-controlled hallways, brief instances where conversations would abruptly mute mid-sentence. Some passengers seemed to vanish when they turned a corner, only to reappear down the hallway. And then there was the crew's strange behavior. One night, Elena overheard whispered conversations among the staff, fragments that didn't make sense. "We can't let them know," one steward said to another, his voice low and urgent. When they noticed her listening, they immediately fell silent, their eyes holding a blank, artificial warmth. She started talking to some of the other passengers she had befriended. An elderly woman at the bar whispered to her about hearing voices in the walls, voices that spoke in languages no one could understand. A young couple mentioned their cabin steward entering their room when they were certain they'd locked the door. The ship's layout became increasingly confusing. Elena would walk down a corridor she was certain she'd traversed earlier, only to find the artwork different, the carpeting slightly altered. Deck maps seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. On the third night, things escalated. During the evening entertainment, the magic show suddenly stopped mid-performance. The magician froze on stage, his smile locked in place, eyes fixed on a point just above the audience's heads. For several long moments, no one moved. Then, as quickly as it had stopped, the show resumed, with no acknowledgement of the bizarre interruption. That night, Elena couldn't sleep. The ship seemed to breathe around her, creaking and shifting in ways that defied the smooth engineering of a modern cruise liner. She decided to walk the corridors, her footsteps echoing in the empty passageways. Perhaps it was the way the light swayed slightly every now and then, but the artwork on the walls seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at it. Portraits with eyes that followed her, maritime scenes that rippled like water. Suddenly she thought of what she overheard from the crewmen. "We can't let them know." For a while it seemed nothing was amiss, but then, near a restricted maintenance corridor, she noticed something odd. Water was pooled around a maintenance door, and the edges of the door seemed to shimmer, almost translucent. Wet footprints led to and from the door, prints that seemed to fade and reappear as she watched. Curiosity overcame her fear. Elena pushed the door open. The space beyond was impossible. It was larger than the ship's physical dimensions could allow, a vast chamber that seemed to exist in a realm between reality and nightmare. Ghostly figures stood motionless, perfect duplicates of the passengers and crew currently on the horizon. She knew because she recognized one figure, the elderly lady who had told her about the whispers she heard through the walls. The figures were translucent, their forms flickering like old television signals, each one an exact replica down to the smallest detail of clothing and expression. Some stood in mid-conversation, mouths open but no sound emerging. Others were frozen in mundane actions, a waiter about to place a drink on a table, a woman mid-laugh, a child reaching for a toy. They were like a living photograph, capturing a moment that could never move forward. Then slowly, one of the spectral figures turned. Its movement was unnatural, a fluid rotation that defied human mechanics. It looked directly at Elena, and she saw its eyes, ancient, intelligent, filled with a hunger that transcended human understanding. And then it smiled. Elena recoiled in horror. The smile revealed row after row of teeth that seemed to fold back into infinity. Something whispered in the back of her mind. Maybe these figures weren't duplicates. Maybe these were really the passengers, turned. Maybe the horizon was more than a ship. It was a hunting ground for something ancient. And now it had noticed her. The spectral figures began to move. The cruise ship cut through the Mediterranean like a knife, its white hull a deceptive mask of innocence. Andy had booked this trip as a gift to himself. From his divorce, from his failing advertising career, from the endless gray of his life in Chicago. The brochure, which had landed conveniently in his mailbox one day, promised transformation. How terribly right it would prove to be. At first, everything felt surreal in its perfection. The other passengers seemed pleasant, the staff friendly and helpful. But then, Andy started to notice small oddities. The way certain crew members would go momentarily still when they thought no one was watching, as if their attention was suddenly elsewhere. The occasional flicker of something, hunger, anticipation, behind their eyes when they thought no one would notice. Andy also noticed strange symbols in unexpected places. Markings he didn't recognize etched subtly into the brass railings, woven into the intricate carpet patterns, carved almost imperceptibly into the wooden panels of the elegant dining room, sometimes appearing in places he was sure no symbols appeared before. The nightmare started on the third night. Andy would jolt awake, drenched in cold sweat, fragments of dark rituals echoing in his mind, chanting, shadows moving against shadows, the sense of something ancient and hungry watching, waiting. During the day, he tried to shake off the feeling. He'd drink at the bar, chat with fellow passengers, but something felt off. He wasn't sure what brought on his sudden paranoia, but even as he spoke to other guests, he would be aware that the staff seemed to be communicating in silent signals, a particular way of tilting a wine glass, a specific pattern of blinking, coded messages just beyond his comprehension. The ship's chaplain particularly unnerved him, an elderly man with eyes that seemed to hold centuries of terrible knowledge. When he smiled at Andy during evening mass, it was like being examined by something that wasn't entirely human. On the sixth night, the chaplain approached him. Andy had been sitting alone on the observation deck, trying to distract himself from the confusion swirling within him. The old man materialized beside him as if conjured from the darkness itself. No footsteps, no warning. "Beautiful night," the chaplain said. His voice was dry leaves rustling over stone. "You've been watching, observing." Andy turned, suddenly aware of how isolated they were. The deck was empty. The night was absolute. "I don't know what you mean," Andy replied, his lips suddenly dry. The chaplain's laugh was something between a cough and a whisper. "Oh, but you do. Some are chosen to see. Most are not." Up close, the man was impossible to age. His skin seemed both ancient and newborn, translucent, with something moving beneath it that shouldn't move in human flesh. "Chosen for what?" Andy asked despite himself. "Passage," the chaplain said. "Not a journey, not a voyage, a transformation." The word hung between them like a physical thing. Andy felt something cold press against the inside of his skull, a sensation just shy of pain. "The passengers," the chaplain continued, "are not passengers. They are vessels, containers, waiting to be filled." Andy wanted to get up and leave, knowing this conversation was not going where he wanted to be, but he couldn't stop himself in his morbid curiosity. "Filled with what?" The old man's smile split his face like a wound. "Everything that exists between what you understand and what you cannot comprehend." A moment of silence. Then, "Would you like to know more?" Andy knew the correct answer was no. He heard himself say, "Yes." One evening, Andy discovered a door at the end of a corridor he has passed many, many times. But it was as if suddenly it had revealed itself to him, its wooden surface carved with those same strange symbols. The metal handle was impossibly cold when he touched it. Whispers leaked from beneath the door. Not human. Something older. Darker. He should have walked away. Every rational part of his mind screamed at him to return to his cabin. But it was his damn curiosity again. He couldn't turn back now. The door opened with a sound like a dying breath. Inside, darkness moved. Figures in dark robes surrounded a central altar. Candles, a yellowish white like human bone, flickered with pale, green-tinged flames. The chanting was a low, guttural sound that seemed to bypass his ears and vibrate directly in his skull. They were conducting a ritual, not of science, not of medicine, but of something far older, far hungrier. And right then, Andy felt with sudden primal clarity that this ship was not a ship. It was alive, and it was hungry. It was something waiting to be awakened. Something that had been waiting a very, very long time. Dr. Helen gripped the stainless steel railing, her knuckles white, as the ship's medical center descended into chaos. The first patients had arrived 12 hours ago, seemingly healthy passengers with sudden, violent fevers that spiked to 104 degrees within minutes. "We're losing control," whispered Dan, the senior nurse, as another patient began convulsing on the examination table. The man's skin was mottled, shifting between pale gray and an unnatural bluish green. His muscles spasmed, bones visibly reconfiguring beneath his skin. Helen had seen infectious diseases before, but nothing like this. The symptoms defied every known medical protocol. Blood tests revealed impossible mutations, cellular structures breaking down and reforming in patterns that resembled neither human nor any known biological classification. Captain Harrison made the decision to quarantine Deck 7 by mid-afternoon. The worst of the 200 passengers, sealed behind reinforced medical-grade doors, monitored through thick glass windows. But the containment was already failing. They had no capacity for this scale of operations, and many had to stay in standard passenger cabins. The first signs of true horror emerged when Sarah Jenkins, a retired school teacher, stopped responding to medical intervention. Her body began to change, not gradually but in sudden, horrific bursts. Her fingers elongated, developing webbing between them. Her eyes, once a soft blue, turned a deep, luminescent green with vertical pupils. "It's like some kind of accelerated evolutionary response," Helen muttered, recording her observations. The medical student side of her silently fascinated. But evolution towards what? By nightfall, the ship's communication systems began to fail. Satellite links dropped, radio signals became garbled. The Meridian was becoming a floating tomb, drifting in international waters with no hope of external rescue. As if to push the situation further beyond the realms of reality, the transformed passengers weren't just changing physically. They began to display a terrifying, coordinated intelligence. They moved with purpose, communicating through low, resonant sounds that vibrated through the ship's metal corridors. Those still human realized, with growing terror, that they were being hunted. Dan was the first of the medical staff to notice the strategic nature of their outbursts. The transformed beings worked together, systematically creating chaos in one room to distract the staff while another tried to escape. Collective intelligence. "We won't be able to control them much longer," Helen realized. "They're becoming something else entirely. We have to land." But she knew what she said was merely wishful thinking. They were nowhere near land, and she knew it. It also became impossible to shield knowledge of this horrific predicament from the rest of the passengers. Survivors barricaded themselves in the ship's upper decks, listening to the horrifying sounds echoing through the ventilation systems. Wet, slapping sounds, inhuman clicks and whistles. The crew tried with all their might to ensure the safety of the passengers, but always in the middle of the night, you would hear an occasional human scream, quickly silenced. Helen discovered the critical detail by accident. Blood samples from the initial patients revealed trace amounts of an unknown marine microorganism, something dredged up from the ocean's deepest, darkest regions. A parasite that didn't just infect, it completely rewrote biological programming. By the fifth night, less than 500 passengers remained unchanged. They watched in terror as the transformed beings, no longer truly human, began flooding the lower decks, and the speed of their transformation. In order to find prey, their bodies adapted. They became fluid, capable of squeezing through impossibly small spaces, adapting to the ship's complex architecture. The ocean itself seemed to conspire with them. Thick fog rolled in, obscuring any potential rescue. The ship's position became unknown, drifting in an endless, dark expanse. In the final hours, Helen understood the true horror. This wasn't just an infection, it was a replacement. Whatever was transforming the passengers wasn't interested in coexistence. It wanted complete biological conquest. As dawn broke, the meridian was silent. No distress signals, no survivors broadcasting their location. Just an immense cruise ship drifting in international waters, carrying its transformed cargo, something entirely new, entirely alien. And waiting, patiently, intelligently, to make landfall.